another episode of the Concrete Logic podcast. And today I got the dynamic duo back, Rich Saichi and Dr. John Belkowitz. Wait, what's the face for?
I thought our nickname was the Reading Trio.
The Reading Trio. Oh, for
Like
this?
all three of us. Yeah.
Well, because we have a book club that we're going to talk about today. We're ACI 323.
Woo woo.
Yeah. I mentioned it to by the time this comes out, y'all have heard from Mr. Colin Lobo, and we kind of talked a little bit about this new code, but today we're going to really talk about it. But before we get started, just remind everybody how you can support the podcast. Go to if you get something out today, and you certainly will, because I've already asked people if they've read this code yet, and 99% said no. So you might, yeah. Anyhow, and if you get something out of the episode today, please share this podcast episode with a colleague or a coworker, and let them know that this thing's out there. The next couple things that you can do is, if you go to concretelogicpodcast.com, there are two ways to get a hold of me. There's a contact button on the top of the page, and then in the lower part of the page, right hand side, there's a little microphone icon there. So you either click on one or the other. If you want to shoot me an email, click on the contact button. If you want to do a voicemail, click on the microphone. And what we're looking for is topic or guest suggestions. Tell me what you want to hear on the podcast. Otherwise, I'm going to keep back. So, which is not a bad thing, I guess. And then the last way you can do is on the same homepage, there's a donate button. So if you get some value out of the podcast, think of how much that's worth to you, and you can click on that donate button, send that over to me, help the podcast, make it better. And then recently, a new way you can get involved. If you're really passionate about concrete, there's another way you can get involved with us. It's the Concrete Logic Academy.com. Go over there, join, and you can actually sit in and shoot me your questions during a podcast, because we're doing these live now. So you can jump in there and say, "Hey, Seth, ask this question," or, "Hey, Seth, you don't know what you're talking about." I don't care. Just get in there and get involved. That's all I care about. So that's it for that. So let's get the topic at hand. I was telling Rich and Dr. John how I was struggling this morning. Every time you buy an ACI code, I got to go in here and put a damn license number in there. It irritates the no end to me. So if someone knows how to fix that, let me know. But anyways, today we're going to talk about the low carbon concrete code requirements and commentary on ACI 323. So if y'all didn't know, this was released recently. And I wanted to bring Rich and Dr. John on to give their initial thoughts. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Rich, should we just let the open the valve on Dr. John, and then we jump in?
So let's talk about big picture first.
Okay.
So ACI has undergone two big changes in the last couple of years. And the first is that reference to, on the very first page, you'll see the word code, right? So that is now part of their title. And that didn't used to be there. So I think it was about 2 years ago, December 2 years ago, they made that change to where that's now part of the title. The other thing is, with 323, a very big committee formed and released that. Now, John and I are going to talk about this. We're going to agree to disagree on a couple of things, which I think, Seth, is why you always bring us on here. ACI got this done in a very short time period. And I'm going to use short as a relative term, because the comparative to that would be, say, ACI 211 on mixing and batching. The last number on that was 91, and that took 30 years to update, right? So I want you to just understand 31, the comparison between the two. So this 323 didn't take 31 years to develop. It happened in very, very quick time frame relative to other ACI documents to update that have been well established for decades. So just as why this is such an important document and at the speed at which this document was produced and released. That's big picture, global. Now, I'm not speaking for ACI. I'm just telling you as a consumer of ACI documents how stark the contrast was. Because we have been waiting for ACI 211. Guys, update. Now, again, these are all people. Most of these people who are on these committees are my friends, John's friends. We know these people. Mm-hmm. They do good hard work. Yes. It just takes time. 323 in comparison was light speed compared to the glacial pace that 211 did. And I'm not saying that disparagingly. I'm just saying it as a contrast. So that's big picture. And the other thing I'll tell you is right now, in the absence of any document, 323 is now the only place for what I would call a published document that you can go to that has applicability for the area of low carbon, global warming potential to be addressed. So we're going to talk about the details and some of the things that we have thought about and found in there, but big picture, this is what we have now, and everything will be based or referenced back to this. So that's my global picture. John, what did I get wrong on that?
There's not a lot of people. Like there's 15 people in this committee. Like at least on this thing. And not a lot of them, and this is where I'm skating the line of an ad hominem. Not a lot of them have concrete manufacturing experience. And this is, I'd like to start off by saying, Seth asked, what did we think of this overall? Overall, this was confusing. I don't want to take one of Rich's sayings right now, but I don't know if it was confusing by accident or on purpose. Right? It's very confusing. I don't know if it's more important for me as somebody who designs concrete, does quality management systems for ready mix providers. I don't know if this is more important. I don't know if ACI 214 is more important or ASTM C94 is more important, especially when it comes to over design. So what I'm going at, just going back to the overall, I think this is going to suck for ready mix producers, rich, licensed design professionals, which somehow includes architects and engineers. I don't know how that makes sense. And then concrete pumpers. The dichotomy between having an extremely low carbon, GWP, the kilogram CO2 equivalent per cubic yard for 4,000 PSI, and a 5,000 PSI. I mean, to get to that same number, according to this, the only way you could do that is aggregate. With the administration, that you have to keep the records, this is going to be a nightmare for everybody. I don't think this is the same thing. That's the other thing I wanted to argue. You guys didn't see what was different. I see that it's going to be harder to pump concrete, especially that, well, I'll get into that later. And then the accounting of all this is just going to be a pain in the ass, especially have to go to some entity called, which I already asked for what the hell that means. I think this is going to make making and transporting concrete much tougher.
Yeah, I think you almost to start, you got to work backwards along the value chain, right? So you've got an owner who wants a result. They hire a general contractor who hires a subcontractor that hires a ready mix producer, right? So let's just call it that, the traditional value chain along there. At some point, that owner, from a design team standpoint, wants a result, and let's just use global warming potential, or GWP as the acronym, is going to say, hey, I want to achieve this level. And then the design team, architects, engineers, are going to say, this makes sense. And then they're going to hand that down that food chain. And I think, John, you're absolutely right. At the bottom of that food chain, you have the ready mix supplier, but now I am directly going to be engaging my material suppliers on the powder side, on the aggregate side, all who are now part of this, because the only document prior to this being released was nothing. It was included in the contract documents that somebody may have quite literally either copied or made up, or they were referencing NRMCA or these kind of things. All good places, but there was no formality or consistency. At least here with 323, it's kind of like if we asked the three of us to write a letter, we would spend the next 3 weeks going back and forth writing a letter. Or I could write the letter and then ask the two of you guys to help me edit it. I kind of am approaching it a little bit of that way of like, there's something that's been written and now we have the ability to help edit it from a practical standpoint when we get to, John, I love my three concretes, the Realcrete. We're going to have to edit this in practice.
Okay, I get it, but it's a code. It's a code. This is not the time to edit it to the point of for strength should have a space between for and strength, and identifying the most important person in this wonderful ACI code. You see how I saved that one there? I almost said some bad
nice.
words.
It's very nice. Nicely done.
Like, I just think this was quickly, I can't decide if this was quickly written. I understand the value chain. It's going to, I'm addressing this as I would ACI 318.
Yeah, I think that's the proper approach.
ACI 214. Like,
so, and I also think you're going to see
something in here that tells you. Go ahead.
I think you're going to see this show up in master spec if it hasn't already, but I would be shocked if this wasn't adopted into master spec or some of those other ones. So when we wind up pulling section 03300 of the contract documents, and on the first 2 pages where it references ACI codes and ASTM standards, this is now just listed there as a default document. And I think you're going to start to see that whether the project or not has a focus on low carbon concrete.
So if the project has a carbon or a focus on low, so this is a question for you, Rich. And then I really want to go into why I don't like this thing. I want to be cut and dry about that. But you are a ready mix provider. Hey, I've learned that when ACI, it's like a 4-year-old. When my 4-year-old wants a snack at 7 p.m. at night, watch the out. Like, it's the same thing with when they want to publish something, whether or not it makes sense, they're going to freaking publish it. And to me, this doesn't make sense. And one of the things that doesn't make sense is on page 5, it's commentary R1.61. It's the third to last sentence where it says, for instance, specifications requiring minimum cementitious contents, the exclusion or limitation of supplementary cementitious material, and mixture requirements of 1200 PSI over design will reduce the flexibility needed by the concrete supplier to meet specified GWP limits. What the hell does that mean?
Oh, that's my get out of jail free card. That is when I see a specification that comes through that says minimum 500 pounds of cementitious material or minimum 600 pounds of cementitious material with my over design. I don't have to hit the GWP limit because somebody has specified a minimum requirement. There's examples of those kind of things in practice all over the place. Let's take Marin County, California, which is being used as an example of registering low carbon concrete. When you dig into theirs, if you designate anything as high early strength, it doesn't matter. And of course, Seth, what project have you ever worked on where you had 28 days to wait for strength on anything.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen. So everything is high early strength, right? Everything is 3 days, 7 day. Every yard of concrete I supply, nobody is putting into practice at 28 days. They're putting into practice it in 2 days, 3 days. They're stripping forms. They're stacking the next level on there. They're rolling traffic on it, even if it's a parking lot, in 14 days or 7 days. So there's all of these get out of jail free cards that exist. I'll give you a great example. Hypothetical, of course. Hypothetical. Let's say that you were a global provider of social media of a large kind, and you were building a giant data center in which you wanted to achieve a low GWP number. And the ready mix supplier said, we can do that. Here is our fancy mix designs using low cement content, using supplementary cementitious materials, using really good sourced 1L cements, all the things. And we hit these numbers through and verified through,
LCAs.
Yeah, right. But EPDs, the whole thing.
Right.
And two things happen when we submit those. One, the engineering company says, oh no, we've never designed concrete with 35% supplementary cementitious materials. Our standard is no more than 15%. And two, there is a cost associated with achieving those results.
Goes up.
That the ownership has said, we don't have that in budget. And then all of a sudden somebody says, well, we really believe in this and it meets the new code that's out, but we haven't accounted for those cost increases. And the designers, again, John, I'm going to open this door for you. The designers have said, we don't want that liability because we don't design past those numbers. Best of luck.
Wait a second, but then you have to go to the authority of having jurisdiction to convince them that you don't have to use this code.
What's an authority of jurisdiction, John?
I don't know. And it's not in here. And I reached out of the 15 authors, I've reached out to 6 of them, and I keep good notes, and none of them have gotten back to me on what that means. Because according to this, there's 3 different types of authorities of jurisdiction. And Rich, you even said one of them had a legal precedent or had a legal meaning to it.
Yeah.
Come on. Which one was it? Here it is. Or the entity adopting the code. Right.
So code adoption is a very interesting concept. So by example, let me give you 2 of the 50 states, depending on who you voted for in the election. Could be 51 states, could be 48. But let's just assume that there's 50 states. And let's go by 2, for example. First, let's take the great state of Texas that does not have a statewide building code. Every building code in the state of Texas can be adopted by a county and or a municipality. By that, I mean an incorporated area. So there are quite literally hundreds of building codes within the state of Texas that may or may not adopt, big term, a code, ACI or otherwise. Go to the People's Republic of New Jersey, okay? The great state of taxation, where John lives. You go there, they have a statewide building code. It doesn't vary by county, municipality, parish, etc. So when you see those phrases of authority that adopts the code,
right?
Seth could build in 2 adjacent cities whose boundary lines touch each other, but he has to comply with 2 completely different building codes. And John, I've even seen people take 318. 318 was the last time it was updated, I think was 2019 or is 22? Is that correct? I think 22.
Something like that.
There are still places in Texas that have that under adoption 2 versions ago, and they won't move off of it.
Right.
So that's kind of my
2014 in here.
So that's kind of my point is that adoption is a big deal.
Okay, but that's only in like 1 or 2 sections. Like every other section, it says something different about who the authority of jurisdiction is. So,
Yeah,
okay.
And I don't know as a professional engineer in a dozen states, so I can be sued in like 20% of the country, right? I don't know. Does that mean each state has a different jurisdiction over my licensing decisions, my design decisions?
I don't know.
I'm with you. I don't know.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that confusion that you're alluding to there is problematic, because I do think the document did a very good job with some of its definitions.
Yeah, sure.
I think they've done a very good job of articulating what some of the most basic terms are, and that we're throwing around like candy in conversations and postings and conferences. When somebody says low carbon concrete, what does that mean? Right? Global warming potential, that's always been very well defined, but now all of a sudden we're getting into, hey, what does that mean relative to concrete mixture designs? I think these are very helpful things for us. Again, I go back to my analogy of writing the letter. A letter has been written, and now we can all come to it and go, edit, edit, edit.
Yeah, you're being a lot nicer than I am, Rich. You know, the reason I don't like it is because it's confusing. And, you know, it's hard enough making concrete nowadays and delivering it to the job site with these low carbon materials, you know, as well as these dirty fly ashes that we have. Now what we're introducing is, I mean, this is P2P on steroids and antibiotics. The only way you can win this game, if you're going to adopt this standard, in which a lot of people are going to be forced, and when I say it's down the line, the ready mix providers are going to have a certain series of mixes that meet this. And for the folks who pump this stuff, I mean, go to the back of the pages. Like these numbers that were created based on mix designs, 4,001 to 5,000 PSI, 278 points, where your cement is 758 to 800 points. The only way to make those numbers is to push granular skeleton. And BTW admixtures don't count.
Yeah, I hate the end around place that this is going to put us, but I actually think this is very positive. And let me give you a couple practical examples. So let's take, and again, I'm going to go with the great state of Texas and a couple of key examples. So I'm going to use municipalities. City of Fort Worth, big city, a lot of concrete being supplied there. They have a specification for 3,000 PSI for their sidewalks. Fantastic. It has to include 6.5 sacks, that's times 94 pounds, 6.5 sacks of cementitious material.
92.6, but
well, that's how they define it, because we changed that in 2013 in ASTM. So they want 6.5 sacks for 3,000 PSI. That's going to get 6,000 PSI. But interestingly, they have a sustainability initiative in the city. Now, wait a second. Do you guys want 6.5 sacks of cement or cementitious material, or do you want a sustainable concrete? They now have an internal conflict to resolve this. Let's go a little bit south. Let's go to the city of Austin. City of Austin is the first municipality in the state of Texas that has said we want low carbon concrete in municipal concrete. So that's the other interesting part, is you also have to make the distinction when a city announces something, or they publicize something, or they have a headline in a newspaper, which some people still read, and says the city of Austin has a new sustainable concrete ordinance. That doesn't mean for commercial. That doesn't mean for private property. That means for city of Austin concrete. Now, what happened was they published this. They didn't know what they were doing or how they were going to measure it or adopt it or it was going to look in practice. And who this hit first was residential builders. And you're thinking residential builders, that's private property. That's a private driveway. That's a private house slab. What about the approach that connects the driveway to the street? that 3.5 feet, Seth, you know what these are. You've poured approaches all over the place. It's the connection between the street that the city owns and the house and the driveway. That now has to conform to that standard. And it can't be placed or poured as the same concrete. Next thing you know,
according to this,
the
Sorry,
cost
go
of concrete for the city of Austin goes up. And they're saying, what happened? How did this occur? Well, because you guys have a low carbon concrete that's undefined and a sustainable initiative ordinance that you passed. So now all of a sudden you're seeing this happen in real time where these conflicts and contradictions are occurring. And those of us down at what I'm going to call the ground level in the jungle, we're having to sort this out in real time.
Yes.
And now all of a sudden, with the advent of 323, somebody's going to hold that up. John, hold it up.
Right.
Wave it angrily and go, look, here's our reference guide, quote unquote, code that we're now going to default as an adopted standard because we as a municipality, county, or state could not do ourselves. So we're going to use this.
Yeah. I think you need to read other sections because this does go to private concrete too. They even use an example of, a few houses in a subdivision are not separate projects, but they are the sum of the whole, or they are part of the whole project. But you'd said something, this is a good attempt, or, hey, we wrote a letter and we can always edit it later. How many years did it take to edit 211?
30, right. 30.
31. So, I mean, you could say those words, man, but you also have said that it takes fucking forever for ACI to edit something. In the meantime, waving angrily, this is going to have an impact. And wait a second, it's not a local impact. As it turns out, during the P2P movement, and this is when I met Rich, during the P2P movement in Dallas, Texas, there were people who were only doing mix, but inadvertently, all their other mixes soon were in some type of evolution affected by the same P2P shtick. So I know, gosh, we can always edit this. We can come back. People aren't going to use it. The GWP thing is a real thing, just like the P2P was, just like the granular skeleton movement, the tarantula curve, high range water reducers. And I go back to first, the concrete pumpers are going to feel this the most right now with pump pressures 2000 PSI plus. Compared to the 1980s, when we were pumping concrete that was 800, 1200 PSI, less chemical, more cement paste. This, as we push more to granular skeleton, and I know this is only going to affect a few, but holy shit, the folks that it's going to affect, it could have been good. And we can't go back in time. We're stuck with this. But to flippantly say we can always go back and edit it, this is not going to be edited.
No,
we're going to celebrate.
Here's where one of the places I'm going to have to disagree a little bit was at the back of that code. There are a bunch of regional tables that list global warming potential by region, and where those are referenced. Those are going to change progressively and frequently as more and more data is collected. Because when you go to those charts, and you kind of say, hey, what was the original data source and how much data was available? More data is going to be available tomorrow than was today. They're going to have to update those on a regular basis. And I think every time they're updating that is an opportunity to update the other things within the document. So they've almost by design, whether again by mistake or design, forced themselves to be updating frequently. They have to. Because again, it's the whole thing I go back to when somebody, the city of XYZ says, oh yeah, we're referencing ACI 318-14.
Mm-hmm.
And wait a second, we're 10 years past that. And they're
Right.
like, oh, no, but this is the one we've adopted. So I think that's one of the challenges that they've created is they've now said, not only have we created 323, but we are committed and we have to be frequently updating.
I don't know if it
Because
says that.
I think
I don't know.
it doesn't
I
say
don't
it,
know.
but
Right.
they have to. Because if they don't,
have to.
then if they don't, this is exactly the place they don't want to be, which is now they've almost discredited the document by like, hey, we're not going to be doing frequent updates. Oh, quite the opposite. You have to do frequent updates.
I think what you're meaning to say is, and there's just one word. I agree with you if you change one word, and it's the word is hope, because even 318 is adopted. Like there was a major change in 2014. Like that was the big, like, I think it was 2014, like the entire, table of contents changed for 318. But this, even if it is adopted or adapted and edited more frequently than, I hate to use ACI 211, all we have to do is be less than 31 years. And that's a long effing time. And granted, this is an anomaly by itself that it exists in a code. I don't see this getting edited again in the next, year or two?
I feel differently about it. I think that they're going to see so much feedback. And the other thing too is, if we go back 3 years in time, and we had this conversation 3 years ago, and 323 didn't exist, and we were talking about low carbon or EDPs or any of these other things.
Right.
That was information we had available at that time. And that had taken 10 years to get to that point. We're now 3 years past that. How much more do we know about this than we did 3 years ago? 3 years from now, imagine what we're going to know, the speed of this development.
Yeah.
So I think they have to progress with the updates, because otherwise you're going to miss out on it. 3 years ago, there were only 3 places I could go to get EDPs. EPDs.
Right, now you can go everywhere.
Well, but next year there will be 6 different places I can go.
Right.
So I think a couple of things. I think you have both the commercial landscape and competitive landscape that's changing, that forces people who write these codes and standards, and I'm one of them, we have to be more current and adopt our internal practices to stay current.
That doesn't mean we have to be foolhardy and reactive instead of taking our time to do things like Seth said. If this is going to help out the world, save the world, it's not like we're making up a vaccine and giving it to people without testing it over a 40-year period. I mean, in and of itself, that would be crazy. It's not like we're creating a new concrete law faster than any concrete law has ever been created and accepted, where the majority of the people do not have concrete experience. What could possibly go wrong, Rich? So I get it. I hope this turn. Don't get me wrong. I'm all for low carbon concrete, but I don't want to ask professors. I don't want professors to tell, and that's what this is. And there's the ad hominem. I don't want professors to tell you, my ready mix providers, how to make concrete. I don't want my professors tying the hands of my concrete pump operators and making pump pressures higher and using more diesel fuel, which increases the carbon footprint, increases the cost at $4.30 a gallon. And as it turns out, it makes it more dangerous pumping concrete. Your pressures increase. And you cannot argue with the fact that from the 1980s, we were at 800 PSI. Now we're well above 2000 PSI for our pump pressures.
Yeah. So you touched on 2 things there I want to follow up on. So I'll go for the second one first. So you mentioned that about the changes. So Seth can talk to this, or any contractor can, that 10 years ago, if you needed to do a project, you estimated the number of yards on a pour and the number of hours you could do that. Now, If I ask any contractor what their curfews are, every one of them will raise their hand and say, oh, I can't work more than 12 hours in a day. I have to work. In fact, it's less than that. So again, one of the ironies I find is that somebody says we want to do low carbon concrete and they try to adhere to that. But instead of placing 1,200 yards in one pour, I have to do that over 3 pours and can place no more than 400 to 500 yards because the operating curfew restricts me. So John, to your point about pump pressures, diesel emissions, all of these other things, I have basically increased that in an effort to produce low carbon concrete, whether it's pump pressures or whether it goes through the sheer number of hours it takes me to do it because of curfews. The second part about that has to do with, John, you had touched on the materials and these other kind of things, is local availability. We haven't addressed that whole concept yet, that to achieve these GWP numbers of local availability of materials, right? There was a building that was constructed. It was the first one in Dallas that wanted to use slag. Now, again, I realize that Seth's audience is global, and in a lot of places in the U.S. or other places, slag is readily available. At this time in Texas, it was not. So it had to be imported out of Louisiana and was actually railed out of Chicago, from Chicago to Louisiana, and then trucked from Louisiana to Dallas in an effort to achieve a low carbon concrete. The engineers, but more importantly, the architects, so I'm going to poke that bear, the architects were out of California and Vancouver. They had used slag before. So for them, this was common and ordinary to achieve this type of concrete. And so they just specified it with a very low water cement ratio.
Heck yeah.
And all of a sudden now, to your point, John, not only was this concrete not producible in 10-yard loads, it couldn't be discharged out of the truck into the pump the way it was specified. So now all of a sudden, to your point, fast forward from that time period now back to 2024 and 323, who, John, is responsible for that concrete coming out of the chute into that pump?
I don't know anymore.
Now I know who it is.
You tell me. You tell me. Is it the owner? Like C94 tells me who it is, right? And you helped change that, but I don't know if C94 matters anymore.
I think C94 matters more than it ever has, but
I hope so.
Now here's the other part about this, and I think this is where it becomes very practical. At the end of the chute, there are only 2 parties responsible. In real time, in the heat of battle, there are only 2 parties responsible at the end of the chute. One is the concrete producer who delivers that concrete. The second one is the individual or entity that purchases that concrete.
Yep.
Right
and that's
there.
In C94, right?
That's correct. And that, in most cases, is going to be Seth. He's purchasing that concrete as a contractor. And that is where, does it matter what the GWP is? Does it matter what the natural pozzolan that was substituted in for the 1L cement? No, none of that matters at that point in time. What matters is the ability to deliver concrete on time in spec. Then we move out, and then we move past that, right? So I think that's the interesting part when we talk about 323 in these codes. At the end of the day, that has to be translated into that relationship. I think there's an impact that this is going to have there. And I think, John, I think that's what you're alluding to.
Right. And I would have liked to have this been a guide well before it was put as a code. Like Seth, I mean, and Seth hasn't said a freaking thing in the last like 20 minutes. We don't let him talk. But I don't know if you noticed his faces, but Seth, you got pissed off like about a minute ago when Rich said something. Your bald spot got a little redder.
No, well, he got angry, but he was also happy before that. So I'm not sure which one of us said something to make him either happy or angry.
I was just waiting for you guys to come up to get some air. I'm as I'm listening, and I was glad to hear that Dr. John thought this document was confusing, because I've read this thing at least 6 times, and I keep flipping back and forth. The first thing that comes to me, again, this is concrete logic, simple thinking. I'm confused why the example they use at the end doesn't even, if you go by the code, you wouldn't have to go by the code.
I don't get that either. You don't need the freaking code. Like,
Yeah.
why would you do that?
It's less than 7,500 yards. So that's confusing. And then, yeah, just again, what I keep thinking about as I listen to you all, if I ask Rich to give me, deliver a certain type of concrete that I want, and to do certain things for the job, to reach a certain strength in a certain amount of time, so we can strip and get moving, or
There you go.
things like that, so I can erect a tower crane on time, things like that. But if this code is listed in the spec, which way does the ready mix guy go? He's got to meet this.
No,
But he can't give the concrete contractor what he wants.
I can tell you exactly which way I go, Seth. I give you exactly what you have asked for as the customer. It could say, hey, we have to have a 4,000 PSI concrete that has a GWP of, 250, right? Just by example. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but let's just call it that. And you're saying, but Rich, I need to strip forms in 72 hours from a schedule standpoint because it rained the last 3 weeks and we're behind. Well, guess what, Seth? You're not getting a 4,000 PSI concrete that used the least amount of cementitious and maximum amount of pozzolanic replacement. I'm going to go up 200 pounds in cement content so you can get back on schedule and catch back the 3 weeks you're behind. And you're going to look at me and go, Rich, make this happen. And I'm going to go, Seth, thank you so much. And we're going to move on from there. What happens to our ability to comply with 323? Out the window. And
that,
Seth,
my friend, is
Seth,
why it's a shitty code.
Seth, tell me if I'm wrong. That's real example of what's going to happen.
I agree with Rich. I agree with Rich. He's right, but that sucks. To me, that means it's a shitty code. Goes out the window. Well, even if, Seth, you could specify that the concrete reaches 8,001 PSI at 28 days, and you don't have to conform to the code, and Rich just has to be a couple 2,000 PSI short of reaching that. I understand there's ways to get out of this code and we can kick it out, but that wasn't the point of designing this code, to find the loopholes. Yeah, it wasn't to be confusing.
Let's talk about that specifically. I'll give you a great example. So Seth has a column that he wants to pour, and that column has to be, let's call it 5,000 PSI column, reasonable number. But he needs to strip forms in 72 hours, right? And hey, Seth, what do you need for form stripping? And he says, I got to have 3,000 in 72 hours. Okay, so I'm going to specify a mix design. I'm going to submit it that says 8,001 PSI in 28 days. Okay, the cylinders break. So he gets his 3,000 PSI in 72 hours. We do the on-site ones, not cured, not cured, for acceptance, but cured for field. He gets it, strips his forms. The acceptance cylinders break at 7,000 PSI. Okay, so 7,000.
Not good enough.
But I submitted 8,001. I've had engineers come to me and say, your concrete is no good because you submitted 8,001, even though we needed 6,000 and Seth needed 3,500 and it met both of those requirements, but they said the mix design failed. Now, does that mean on every GW, everything conforming to 323, I submit 8,001 PSI, even though the F prime sub C is only supposed to be 3,000, 4,000, 5,000?
Or you convince the authority of jurisdiction that you don't need this. I mean, can I go backwards? I want to bring.
I wanted Seth to hear that because I could see him smiling about that, going, "That's what happens. That's what happens on a construction site when you're building things."
I get it. And the people who design this, the majority of them aren't on construction sites. And that's why you're throwing this away like the baby and the bathwater. The code and the low carbon concrete are going out. And by the way, 211 isn't a code. It's a guide.
It's a guide.
Right? 318, which if I'm a structural engineer, by the way, did you ever notice when you say an STR word, strength, structural, you don't say S, you say SH? So say structural and then try to say it with an S instead of an SH. It doesn't sound right. Structural. Anyway, when I'm designing with ACI 318 and I decide not to use the section on punching for a column that's going through a square foundation or footing, and I say, you know what, I'm not going to use the amount of steel that the ACI 318 leads me to. I'm only going to use 75% of it, and then there's a failure. And then there's a failure. Whose fault is it, right? My fault.
That's correct.
So inadvertently, hold on, I'm almost done. Inadvertently, what I think this is going to do is, one, confuse people all over the board, not just Seth, every PEs, ready mix providers, contractors. Two, I think what this also has done, it has soured the term code. I don't think the term code holds the same relevancy because you're ready to throw this out pretty quickly. I wouldn't throw out 318. Not in a heartbeat.
John, I want to amend one of your statements there when you listed, you just listed engineers and designers. I want to add one group into there. I'm going to say policymakers. Because the policymakers in these local jurisdictions are going to just default to the adoption of. And I can see that coming a mile away. They're going to ask their local engineering consultants, experts, people who work in their municipal departments, and they're going to say, hey, rather than us write our own thing, what should we do? And then you're going to see adoption. I use that word specifically of this.
So I was part. I'm sorry. I'll let you finish.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, John.
I was part of a state, and I really shouldn't say the state because I've already been pissing on a bunch of people's Cheerios this morning. But I was part of one of these conversations, and the state, west of the Mississippi, had hired a university to create their own numbers. Instead of using the regional numbers, they're going to have state specific. And it turned out the numbers were 20% than the GSA numbers, which was, federal level, and then the regional standards that are in the code right now. And when they were using to define these numbers were concrete and, let's say, pavement mixes that were made with type 1-2 cements and much cleaner aggregate than we have today.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So going further down the road, one of those states, I think there's 11 states that have been forced to adopt it early or volunteered to adopt it for a certain amount of money. Sorry, I don't know the difference between volunteered and forced to do it to get some money. I apologize.
I think it's called ransom.
Okay, sure. Whatever you want to call it, Stockholm Syndrome. This is a cluster of a cacophony of issues on the horizon. And I think the great Gary Brown from the American Concrete Pumping Association once said that the concrete pump is the ultimate lie detector on a job site.
John, you've been poking at this for a little bit, and I want to just add one caveat to it.
Poking the bear, baby.
Because I think when you talk about pump and pump pressures, I think one of the things that we as ready mix producers have to contend with is the infamous ASME B27. That kind of is the bane of my existence when it comes to concrete pumps, because that is a document that isn't even remotely connected to ASTM, ACI. It's the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, basically concrete pumping code or equivalent, in which it assesses and assigns responsibility for what happens using a pump to the, and I love this term, liquid structural material supplier.
Right.
Translation, concrete producer.
Concrete pump. Yeah. Okay.
Right. So now all of a sudden, and in every legal dispute that occurs using a concrete pump truck, ASME B27 is used as the reference document. That document right now, as it sits and exists, does not contemplate the existence of 323. And John, when you're talking about problems with concrete pump pressures and these increases and everything else, that document doesn't even know 323 has been created, exists, and it is going to sit there statically and assigning those issues. Now, I realize we've gone down a rabbit hole there, but I think if you're going to mention concrete pump pressures and changes and those kind of things, you cannot do that without the reference to ASME B27.
Okay.
So I only say that to make Seth's audience aware, because many of them aren't aware that that document even exists until you run into problems. And I don't wish those problems on anybody, but I can tell you right now, you have to be aware of that or exclude that. And I would encourage people to exclude that in writing from contract documents. And that's just my little PSA there. But anyway, I didn't mean to go down that rabbit hole. I didn't mean to go down that.
No.
But I think, John, if you're mentioning that, you can't say concrete pump pressures without mentioning ASME B27.
Okay, ASME B27. I mentioned it. That being said, I've got to leave here in a second. I apologize. I have another phone call to jump on. I want to continue this conversation again. I think there are a lot of people who are a little nervous about this, to include the folks from the American Concrete Pumping Association, who just learned about this last week. And that's their fault, our fault for not being more involved.
Yeah, and I applaud Seth for giving us a little bit of a platform here, for introducing this and being current with this kind of discussion, because I think it's a relevant one. I think what's going to be interesting is following up on this conversation in 6 months, and what we know to be true, what we know to be true today versus what we're going to see in practice in 6 months. And I think we will actually see an impact. So, Seth, congratulations to you and the Concrete Logic podcast for broaching this and not being afraid to do so. But like I said, I think there's a follow-up in 6 months to see what we're seeing out there in the field.
May 6th, we're going golfing, though. Golfing. Tennessee.
Yeah, that's kind of like in the middle of us all.
See?
All right. Well, we'll end today. I got, oh, God, I just keep reading these first 2 pages and it makes.
Stop. Don't upset yourself, man.
This code does not address strength, stability, serviceability, durability, and integrity of concrete structures.
It even says that compressive strength is not a good rubric for GWP, but hey, we don't got any other data, so we're going to use it anyway.
Yeah.
Like, come on, Rich. Like, that's not cool. Like, that's bad. All right, I hate to do this. I really got to go, guys.
No. We'll wrap it up here today. We did 50 minutes plus, so that's plenty for today. Rich, Dr. John, thank you for coming back on the show. I will have your contact information in the show notes so people can reach out to you and yell at you. Please read ACI 323, and we'll circle back on this for you all later on. And until next time, let's keep it concrete.
Thanks.
Right.
There he goes. He's gone.
Thanks, Seth. Appreciate it.